Good morning, everyone. In the last class, we had studied about the friction, in which you had studied that how friction is said to be a necessary evil. Means there were some pros and cons of the friction. Today, we are going to study about the methods of increasing friction. Actually, in our daily life, there are some situations in which we need to increase the friction, as well as there are some situations in which we need to decrease the friction. So there are many situations when we can't do anything without friction. To overcome skidding along a slippery surface, we adopt measures to increase friction. Similarly, kacha roads get muddy and slippery during rains. It is not possible to drive on such roads, for this sand and gravel are spread over the mud to make the road rough. Similarly, tires of our vehicles and also soles of the shoes are grooved. This increase friction. This helps easy rolling of vehicle on the road and also provide better gripping with the shoes on the floor. So we can understand that in some cases friction is desirable for us. It means that we need to increase the friction. Let's see how we can increase the friction. So there are two methods of increasing friction. The first one is making the surfaces rougher. For example, sand scattered on icy roads, baseball players wearing textured batting gloves. This helps to increase the friction. And the second way is to increase the force pushing the surfaces together. Example, pressing sandpaper harder when sanding a piece of wood. Do you know why kabaddi players and wrestlers rub their hands with soil? Weightlifter, gymnasts use some coarse material to increase the friction for better grip. Athletes and other sports persons often make use of friction when they play. Gymnasts often apply some coarse materials, substance like the chalk powder on their hands. By doing so, they actually increasing the friction between their hands and the uneven bars. This gives actually a better grip for them. Similarly, in some cases, it is desirable for us to reduce friction. Means friction becomes undesirable and we want to reduce friction. So there are some methods to reduce the friction, like lubrication and changing the type of friction, means converting sliding kinetic friction to rolling and making the surfaces more smoother. So let us talk more about this reducing friction. To reduce the contact area by using rollers, ball bearings or wheels, we can decrease friction. Changing the surfaces of the material that are touching by using lubrication like the motor oil, wax or grease, and roll object instead of sliding them. And one more thing, creating a cushion of air like that in the case of a hovercraft or a air hockey table. Now let us see more about this in details. Polishing, as you see in the figure, polishing is a way through which we can reduce the friction up to some extent. Actually, when we polish a surface, its roughness decreases, the surface becomes smooth and friction gets reduced. We also sometimes rub the surfaces with a fine sandpaper to reduce their unevenness. As you can see in the figure, a person is polishing the car bump with some polishing material. By doing so, it will reduce the friction on its surface, and one more thing will be there, the surface become more shiny. We polished jewels also in watches to hold axles between them. So there are lots of use of polishing to reduce the friction. Now let us talk about the next process, that is the lubrication. Lubrication means by adding lubricants between the two parts of the machinery we can reduce the friction. As we all know that when a few drops of oil are poured on the hinge of door, the door moves much more smoothly. Bicycle and motor machines also greased between their moving parts, and it helps in reducing the friction between them. In all these cases we want actually to reduce the friction in order to increase the efficiency. Lubricants can be of three types: liquids lubricant like oils, semi-liquid like grease, and solid like the talcum powder. As you can see in the figure, actually when we apply a lubricant between the moving part of a machine, a thin layer of this lubricant is formed between the two surfaces. As the surfaces now do not rub against each other directly, friction is reduced. Interlocking of irregularities is avoided between the now changed surface and movement becomes smooth. So oiling, greasing of machine results in less wear and tear and hence less energy wastage. This helps to increase the efficiency of the machines. So lubrication is key when sliding contact is present. Lubrication are used to reduce friction and wear by the preventing metal to metal contact. Our next example is of the solid lubricants, like in that case, in the case of the carom boards. When we play a game of carom board, we often sprinkle talcum powder on the carom board. Do you know why? Actually, by sprinkling the talcum powder on carom board, the friction between the striker and the board is very much reduced, and the striker moves smoothly on the board and the coin slides over the board. The next method of reducing friction is by using the ball bearings. Ball bearings, as you know, that are based on the rolling friction, and we know that rolling friction is smaller than the sliding and the static friction. So sliding can be replaced by using rolling. In most of the machines we use of ball bearings. For example, we use ball bearings in shafts of motors, dynamos, axles of vehicles, and so on. Lots of machines are used in your house, like the fan and bicycle, motorbike. These are also used the ball bearings for the smooth movement. One more way of reducing the friction is a hovercraft. And actually hovercraft is a vehicle which travels on both land and water without much friction. It moves on a cushion of air provided by the powerful pumps. Means there are pumps which are present in it, inside it, and with the help of that it has a air cushion which helps to reduce the friction. As in the case of the hovercraft, an air cushion between the moving part is used to reduce friction. Actually, it provides an elastic cushion between the moving parts and reducing friction. It has the added advantage of preventing dust and dirt from collecting on the moving parts. These properties of the air, because the hovercraft are based on the reducing friction with the help of the air cushion. These properties of the air plays a very important part in the smooth riding of a hovercraft, and so that it can be easily move on the surface of both water and land without much disturbance. Now let us talk about our next topic, which is the fluid friction. Fluids are those materials which has the property to flow. So we can say that both gases and liquids are together known as the fluid. So we now know that whenever an object moves over the surface of another object, frictional force comes into play. This opposes the relative motion between them. But what happens in the case when object move through air? What do you think? The air also exerts a force of friction even though it is very light and thin. Means air can also apply the force of friction against the motion of the object, and we call this friction as the air resistance. And it also opposes the motion of objects through it. As you can see in the case of figure, a person with the help of parachute is diving down, and this parachute is facing the air resistance so that the person can be easily sliding down safely. So air, water and other liquids also exerts force of friction, and we call such type of force of friction as the fluid friction. Now let us see fluid friction depends on what factors. Actually the fluid friction depends on the following factors. The first one is the nature of the fluid, second is the shape of the moving object, and third one is the speed of the moving object. Clear? Now let us see one by one about these things. Nature of the fluid tells us that whether the fluid is viscous or not. If it is more viscous, means if its density is more, then it will apply a large amount of the frictional force acting against the direction of motion of the object. The second point, shape of the moving object, actually tells us about the area of contact. Means if the area of contact is less, then the frictional force acting will be also less, but if the area of contact is more, then the frictional force acting on that will be also more. And one more important thing, most important thing, is the speed of the moving object with respect to the fluid. If the speed of the moving object with respect to the fluid is more, then more frictional force will be act on this. For example, air resistance increases with an increase in the speed of the object moving through it. Means when any object suppose falling towards the earth surface, then it will have to face more frictional force as the speed of the object is moving increasing fastly. To overcome this situation, we have to design such type of objects which have streamlined shape, and these streamlined shape are actually used to reduce the fluid viscosity, or we can say fluid friction. The fluid friction always act against the direction of motion of the object. In class 6 you have already learned that birds and fishes have to move about in fluids almost all the time. Their bodies must have evolved to shapes which would make them lose less energy in overcoming the fluid friction. If we look carefully at the shapes of an aeroplane and a boat, do you know what do we actually have observed? We find that the shape of an aeroplane has some similarities to that of the birds, whereas the shape of the boat is somewhat similar to that of a fish. Means these are similar to the structure of the natural things. Nature thus gives us some useful ideas to overcome the fluid friction, and scientists put them to use in designing the shapes of the objects. Sports vehicles are often so designed, means more pointed towards the front, that air flows smoothly over the air surface. That is, every air particle passes at a particular point with the same speed and in the same direction, and this is known as the streamline flow. And these special shaped bodies are called the streamline bodies. Thus, streamline flow of air over the surface of a vehicle reduces friction and helps it to acquire a faster speed. So that we can say that streamline flow is such type of flow in which objects are specially designed to reduce the friction, and those specially designed objects are said to be the streamlined bodies. Actually, the racing cars which we have seen that move really very fast are given a very different shape. These shapes are said to be streamlined, and this helps to reduce the friction. So that we can say that the friction can be minimized by using certain steps like providing the streamlined bodies.